Let's talk action potentials. A couple different types of action potentials. Cardiac myocytes, pacemakers, also known as nodal cells. We'll talk a little bit about the effects of sympathetic versus parasympathetic control of heart rhythm and contractility. Also, effects of hyper and hypokalemia. Um, Electrical current is generated in these pacemaker, also known as nodal cells. Most importantly, it'll originate, or hopefully, from the SA node. Waves look like this, and then it'll transmit from one cardiac myocyte to the next cardiac myocyte. Their action potentials look like this. These are the ones that are actually contracting. These are simply originating the current. Just another fun picture. Notice that the ions are moving through these gap junctions where calcium and sodium can travel through. It's kind of like the equivalent of the nodes of Ranvier, where sodium can link through to initiate the next action potential of the adjacent node. Here we're initiating the next action potential of the adjacent cardiac myocyte. Mostly phase zero, just sodium and a little bit of calcium that's leaking through these, causing, passing the signal along, but also causing sarcomeric contraction. So it's really just, again, hitting this point home, just one domino knocking over another as the signal is passed from one cell to the next. So we start off in the SA node, you go to the AV node where there's a delay. This also plays defense. We will talk about that. This then goes through the bundle of His. There's a left bundle branch and a right bundle branch. The right bundle goes to the right ventricle. The left bundle goes to the left ventricle. Probably for most of these, we'll just think about it in terms of the left ventricle. Also keep in mind that the left ventricle is going to be much more important for arrhythmias and also pairing things up with anti-arrhythmic medications and ECGs, just because it's the dominant and much larger of the ventricles. So, yeah, there's a lot of similarities to neuronal action potentials, but one, you can just see how different these look. That's 1 millisecond. And in skeletal muscle, it might be 2 to 5 milliseconds. It lasts a little bit longer. Cardiac muscles is very long, especially because this plateau phase 2, and this slow repolarization, phase 3. Flow of ions is also going to be different, as we'll see in a second. Not just, and of course, I guess the flow of ions is what makes the graph look different. So on top of this, we also have, probably 10 different types of action potentials. 3 main ones. We can think of the pacemaker cells in the SA node and the AV node. SA node has a faster rate and is therefore dominant over the AV node. So in other words, every time the AV node or the SA node fires, if it fires twice as quickly, as it fires, maybe if it's twice as quickly, the AV node will be halfway through its depolarization, its initiation, but it gets reset by the SA node's previous firing that hits it. That's what we mean when we say the SA node is dominant. We'll see an example of that later. We also have the cardiac myocytes, the atria and the ventricles. Notice that these have the flat, and then this is also considered flat. It's a little bit weaker. That's why it looks different. Also, when we're looking at ECG, I'm going to say this again and again, the ECG is only pairing up with cardiac myocytes. It doesn't actually pick up anything from the pacemaker cells. It's just not a strong enough of an electrical signal. And then lastly, Purkinje fibers. So Purkinje fibers are kind of like cardiac myocytes. They're in the ventricles, but you know what? They also have this. The phase 4 here is drawn like this. The reason I corrected it is it should be like this. This down slanting phase 4 is very important. It's really what gives pacemaker cells their distinct flavor, is this automatic inbuilt rhythm. So the Purkinje fibers have a little bit qualities of both of them, and then their rate's going to be really small. So SA node is going to be dominant over AV, which is dominant over Purkinje. So in the MCAT and pre-MAT, we're used to salty banana, sodium on the outside, potassium on the inside. And now we're bringing calcium into the picture too. So we can think of this as like salty, milky banana, right? Salt on the outside and banana on the inside, but now it's salt and calcium and banana, potassium on the inside. Same for a nodal cell as well. So the ion gradient's different, but or similar, but there's a lot of differences between the action potentials that we'll get into. This is probably more detail than you would ever want, but I really think not only can they get pretty meticulous and detail oriented for the NBMEs, but it also, understanding this is really going to set the groundwork for understanding arrhythmias, understanding ECGs, EKGs, and antiarrhythmic medication. So, if you want to just brute force memorize everything, go, by all means, but I think this will just make it easier down the road. So if you have like a firm understanding of the physiological principles. So for a normal neuron, slight impulse, baroreceptors are stressed or whatever, or a little bit of sodium, rushes in, not enough to get it to the negative 55, nothing happens. Here we're starting at negative 70. Enough of a stimulus causes us to go to negative 55. Voltage-gated sodium channels open all the way to positive 40. Those close. Voltage-gated potassium channels open. Repolarizes, hyperpolarizes, which is why we have a little bit of a refractory period. And it goes back to the resting membrane potential. The membrane potential is set by the potassium gradient, which is leaky, and the sodium potassium ATPase pump. So that's neuron. All of that is that should be a refresher. And I'm mainly just illustrating that so you can understand better how the pacemaker and cardiac myocyte action potentials are generated. So starting at negative 70 or so, it's going to automatically creep upwards, right? Here we needed some big stimulus. Here just automatically, it's just built into the system that it slowly lets in a little bit of sodium. Some people say these are sodium potassium channels, but from what I've seen in the research I've done, it's mostly just sodium. So these are called funny channels. It's called phase 0. These are funny channels. Phase 4, funny channels. Sodium's coming in, and it's slowly depolarizing it, right? I mean, if a cell is 0 over here and negative 70 over here, then a sodium coming in should make it, go from negative 70 to negative 60. And that's exactly what we're seeing. This is happening during diastole, and this is depolarizing it. So this is called DD, diastolic depolarization. At about negative 50, calcium channels open. What kind? T calcium channels. I think T for timely because they arrive, on time. A little bit later, negative 40. So that the calcium coming in is going to, it's going to exacerbate the depolarization. Negative 40, I think L for late, but really it's L for long because they are open for a lot longer. The T channel shut, the L one stays open, and that is responsible for the phase 0. This jumps all the way up to, positive 20, voltage-gated potassium channels open, L channels close, and it now repolarizes. It's very analogous to what we see with the neuron. And then it goes here, and then it just automatically creeps up again. So it is this right here that is responsible for setting the heart rate. For the most part, if this happens once every second, then you could imagine that our heart beats once every second. Obviously, this takes a little bit of time, but I would say this is the main factor for heart rate. All right, so then we're going to go ahead and look at cardiac myocytes. So this was previously was a nodal cell pacemaker SA node. Now we're looking at a cardiac myocyte. So starting at negative 90, unless it's a Purkinje, this should be a flat line, so we're not having the up slope. And the or initial neuron or action potential phase called phase 0. So phase 4 flat, phase 0 is really what's kicking everything off, is voltage-gated sodium channels. So voltage-gated sodium channels are opening, or it depolarizes, I guess, a little bit to negative 70 from negative 90. Then the voltage-gated sodium channels open, bumps it all the way up. Now voltage-gated potassium channels open, brings it down a little bit. Those close, and now we have this inward, outward fight of calcium and potassium. Slow, delayed rectifier potassium channels open, which want to exodus, and L calcium channels are open. The same L calcium channels that we saw in the pacemaker cells. Pacemaker cells are really the only ones that utilize the T channels. So the calcium and potassium out that we have for phase 2 causes this plateau. And this is associated with the QT interval and ventricular contraction. And then as the L channels close, the fast delayed rectifier channels open, and with the fast ones, on top of the fact that there's less calcium coming in through the L channels, we're going to have a vigorous repolarization, bringing us down to the resting potential. During this is where all of the calcium-induced calcium released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum with the ryanodine receptors and the binding to troponin and the tropomyosin is all occurring. Note that towards the end of this, SERCA sucks the calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which we've talked about before. All right, so that's a lot of information. I do think it's important, but more important is just to get the basic gist. Phase 4 of the pacemaker is diastolic depolarization. Phase 0, calcium runs in through L-gated channels, also known as dihydropyridine channels. Phase 3, potassium leaves, and that is the nodal cells, the cardiac action potentials. Phase 0 is sodium in. There is a balanced calcium trying to run into the cell, potassium trying to run out of the cell, and eventually the calcium channels close and the other fast delayed rectifier potassium channels open, which causes even more potassium to leave, not countered by calcium anymore, and that repolarizes everything. The resting potential, again, is set by the leaky potassium channels in addition to the sodium-potassium pump. So if that's still too long, you can recognize the differences. This is flat, and there is no flat portion here. The flat portion is associated with the contraction, which lasts for quite a while. So the impulse is passed to the next cell, really after this point. So it's being passed to the next cell, and this first cell, yes, it's passed the signal, electricity first, contraction second. The electricity is passed really quickly, but the contraction actually takes a while. So the plateau corresponds with myocyte contraction, dihydropyridine, L-type calcium channels. These are going to do calcium-induced calcium release with ryanodine receptors, the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Eventually, SERCA is going to try to, after we've had our contraction, right, the calcium binds to troponin, shifts tropomyosin, myosin binds to actin, sarcomere contracts, etc. The calcium needs to be recycled and needs to be put back into the back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum if we want to initiate another muscular contraction. And we want a nice full contraction. We need a lot of calcium in so we can have a big calcium release. So SERCA is really necessary for the relaxation, and the relaxation is necessary for a big next contraction, a large subsequent following stroke volume. We have some protein called phospholamban, which is inhibiting SERCA, which means we'll have less contractility and less relaxation. Beta-adrenergic receptors via pKa can phosphorylate the phospholamban. Inhibiting it, we're inhibiting the inhibitor, which means the circuit can work. So beta-adrenergic receptors, in addition to stimulating this, and getting us better contractility, also are going to stimulate the SERCA by inhibiting phospholamban, which is further stimulating contractility and stimulating lusitropy relaxation, which is also necessary for a maximum contraction. And this is just, old news. We know about sarcomeres contracting. We know about calcium binding troponin. And this is just a nice, pretty picture of the beta-1 agonist, the epinephrine, the norepinephrine, binding to that receptor. It's a G protein coupled receptor. We get a G alpha, we get adenylate cyclase, we get CAMP, that gets PKA. PKA phosphorylates the phospholamban so that circuit can do its job and push calcium against its gradient into the sarcoplasmic reticulum to sequester it for the next contraction, so we can get a full contraction after our first contraction. How does this relate to an ECG? I know it looks complicated, but at the end of the day, that is the direction of the current. This is lead 2, and we said that this is the atrial contraction, this is the ventricular contraction, and then the actual, and when I say contraction, what I really mean is the electrical signal. The actual contraction is technically happening here, right? The actual contraction of the atria is actually happening right after. And the ventricular contraction is going to take a lot longer. And then this is the repolarization. So I know that let's just look at the P wave. Some of it's probably going that way, some of it's going that way, some of it's going that way. What we're doing is we're integrating the signal from the cardiac myocytes. And if it's going towards the lead 2, we call that a positive deflection. And We are not, again, concerned with nodal pacemaker cells. They do not show up. Like this is the AV node, right? It's all completely flat. This is muscle, and this is the repolarization of muscle. And so, yeah, if we put it all together, you notice this is our pacemaker cell, the SA node. This is yellow. And what do you know? Yellow is flat. What do you know for green? Atrial muscle. Boom. We get an upward deflection. What do you notice for the ventricular muscle? Boom. We get an upward deflection and another upward deflection for the repolarization. Trying to think what else about this. The ventricular muscle is really just the epicardium, endocardium, and mainly the myocardium is where most of the muscle, most of the oomph is generated. And as we said before, here's our electrical contraction, but the actual phase 2 and contraction is probably going to happen somewhere in this region over there. We have this refractory period here where the cardiac myocyte cannot fire again. This is just to make sure that it's to prevent reentry circuits. It's to make sure that everything is contracting, they're moving the electrical impulse along in a nice single file line. So we have a coordinated muscular contraction. What happens if we don't have this? You get something like atrial fibrillation, ventricular fibrillation, where there's a quivering of the muscles. They're all firing at different rates and kind of ignoring the domino effect. And if everyone's not coordinated, you don't adequately push the blood from the atria to the ventricles or from the ventricles to the aorta or the pulmonary circuit, which has obviously catastrophic consequences. So how can we change the pacemaker cells in the cardiac myocytes? Sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system can affect the pacemaker cells. Those same things can also affect the cardiac myocytes. Hyperkalemia and hypokalemia, changes to calcium, can affect the nodal pacemaker cells, and they can also affect the cardiac myocytes, which we'll talk about right now. Sympathetic nervous system, this does a lot. It affects the calcium, it changes the resting potential. Let's just focus mostly on phase 4. So sympathetic nervous system increases the rate of phase 4. And if I increase the rate, we said that this is really what determines the heart rate. That's a quicker heart rate. This is a normal heart rate. And then this is a slower heart rate, which is the vagus parasympathetic nerve. That's really it at the end of the day. Sympathetic nervous system, we said, stimulates dihydropyridine receptors, which are really just L-gate calcium receptors. More calcium in the cytosol really just means that the contractility is up. They can also stimulate the ryanodine receptors. And we said that through pKa, they're going to phosphorylate phospholamban. This means that SERCA is now uninhibited, so it can absorb more calcium, sequester it, increasing the contractility for the next contraction. Hyperkalemia, so this is really important. This will come into arrhythmias, into the ECG, into the antiarrhythmic drug. So I think it's really complicated. It's really important to have a sound understanding of this. So hyperkalemia is when we have more potassium on the outside of, or let's say in the plasma, at least in the blood. So normally this is the picture. We have 0, we have negative 70. And it might seem like if I put a bunch of potassium here on the outside, it might seem like, okay, now it's going to go from negative 70 to an even larger differential. Now it's going to be something like negative 70 to negative 90. And it turns out it's the opposite effect that you would think about, which we'll talk about briefly. So hyperkalemia depolarizes the cell. So it's going to bring it from, so this is normally where it sits, and now it's going to sit right here. And it might seem like, this is because there's a decreased incentive for potassium to leave, which we'll talk about. Note that hypoxia and ischemia also produce the same effect. If you don't have ATP, you can't fuel the potassium gradient, so you can't put the potassium on the outside. But nevertheless, we'll get more into this. Both of these are going to have the same effect by pushing us from here to here, depolarizing it. That might seem like a good thing. It might seem like it more easily fires and we have a faster rate, but it actually turns out that if you depolarize, it's harder to open up our sodium channels, which means that we're less likely to initiate a subsequent contraction. We'll get into the details of that a little bit. It's crazy confusing, very important. And the polarization, so going down here, is actually going to be better to sufficiently activate the funny channels and so the sodium channels of the pacemaker cells and also the sodium channels of the ventricular myocytes. So Long story short, hyperkalemia will cause bradycardia. Now, note that these effects are particularly salient for Purkinje cells. And so this can cause lots of arrhythmias, specifically ventricular tachycardias, which we'll get to. Hypokalemia, all the opposite effects. This hyperpolarizes the cell. Again, this is paradoxical. We'll talk about this. And this is going to increase the phase 4 slope, which is going to cause tachycardia. Now, a cure for high hyperkalemia is one, just insulin. If you have insulin, you'll talk about this in the renal unit, pushes potassium into the cell. So too much potassium outside the cells, well, good. Just get some insulin, it'll push them in. Another cure is actually calcium. So what does calcium do? Calcium does a couple different things. One, it contributes a little bit to the depolarization of our pacemaker cells through the calcium channels. Two is it can stimulate the sodium channels directly by binding to calmodulin and stimulating the calcium channels. Probably most importantly is it somehow raises, so high potassium might raise our resting potential from here to here. High calcium, on the other hand, raises the threshold potential from here to here. So if I need to get from here to here to have a firing, that's a certain amount of distance. Getting from here to here, we've raised the resting potential. So if we raise the threshold potential, the actual difference between those might be the same. That is one way that calcium helps. Sometimes people say this stabilizes the membrane potential, but that's really what they mean, is it raises the threshold potential so that, if it was, negative 80 to negative 60, well, now it's negative 70 to negative 50, something like that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about exactly how this is happening with the potassium. This is maybe our normal state of affairs for a cell. We have more, salty, milky banana. I have more sodium and calcium on the outside of the cell, more potassium on the inside of the cell. And at the end of the day, I made up these values. This is negative 10, and actually, I suppose we should say that this is 0 and this is negative 10. So that's 0 and that's negative 10. Now we have hyperkalemia. So this initially, like the second I eat like 8,000 bananas, I now have very high potassium levels in my blood. This is going to cause it to go to now technically be hyperpolarized, right? And this is what we might think. It's like, if you have more potassium, this should cause a hyperpolarization. So what is Will talking about when we say that it is it's depolarized? Well, this is just initially. Notice as well that initially potassium is balanced. There's a concentration gradient trying to push it out, which is countered with the electrical gradient pushing it in. Why does it want to go out? Because there's a lot of potassium inside the cell and not a lot of potassium outside of the cell. Why does the electrical gradient want to push it in? Well, because it's particularly positive outside the cell, 0, and it's particularly negative 10 inside the cell. Something like calcium, it's going down both its electric and concentration gradient, same with sodium. So potassium's a little bit more confused here. Now, if we initially put hyperkalemia into the equation, now what we've done is there's maybe an equal amount there's 6 potassiums on the outside and 6 on the inside. So there's not actually any concentration gradient anymore. I only have an electrical gradient. In fact, a stronger electrical gradient than we previously had. So this is going to cause a bunch of the potassiums to run into the cell. And now that a lot of the potassiums have run into the cell, it changes up our math a little bit so that now the difference is negative 9. It's negative 9 and 0. And this is, at the end of the day, lowering the so hyperkalemia at the end of the day, after everything is equilibrated and whatnot, this is actually going to depolarize, not hyperpolarize it. Another way of putting this is that potassium is what sets the membrane potential. And if I have a lot more potassium on the outside of the cell, then the potassium does not want to leave. So effectively, the electric potential of potassium might be negative 100 normally, but now it's going down. Or actually, I guess it's negative 84. But now it's going down from negative 84 to maybe like negative 74. So having potassium on the outside decreases the electric potential, the desire of potassium to leave, and therefore the membrane potential becomes more depolarized. And a depolarized membrane potential means that the voltage-gated sodium channels, both for the pacemaker cells and for the cardiac myocytes, are slightly disabled. They're still active, but they are less active, which contributes to less contractility and less a slower heart rate as well. And I suppose the last thing to talk about this is that, so here we have our hyperkalemia, and this is actually a pretty good picture. So maybe normally the membrane is around here. So if you hyperpolarize the cell, which would happen with hypokalemia, hypokalemia is going to cause it to hyperpolarize, which means this is specifically referring to the Vmax for the sodium channels. So hyperpolarizing it causes these channels to be more open, which is going to cause a more intense phase zero climb and faster action potential and a faster rate. On the other hand, if you depolarize it, which we said would happen in hyperkalemia. So hypo is going to go here. Hyperkalemia is going to lower the membrane potential. So this would be hyper. So lower in the sense of the absolute value. So it's going to become more depolarized. Now we can see that the Vmax is lower, which just means the sodium channels aren't working. This is what you're going to get. This is a classic hyperkalemia. Normally we shoot up very intensely. We're shooting up a lot more weakly now. Another important thing is that actually maybe before we even get to that. So it is, if I therefore have hyperkalemia, it means that it's going to be more difficult to initiate an action potential, not just in the cardiac muscle, but also in the skeletal muscle. And one way you can think about this is that there will be paralysis and weakness because we have a harder time initiating an action potential because the sodium channels are not properly activated. Again, they have to reach a very negative potential to be activated, and that's just not occurring here. Another thing to note is that, again, kind of ironically, paradoxically, potassium is going to leave the cell more intensely, which doesn't, to me, make a whole lot of sense because the main reason that potassium didn't want to leave the cell is because we had this large electrical gradient, -10. And I would think that now that it's at -9, that's going to be smaller, has more incentive to leave, but it's just not the case for whatever reason. So we're going to see a sharper repolarization phase 3 in hyperkalemia and a lower one here. So I know that this was a lot and I probably could have articulated better. Big takeaway is that hyperkalemia causes slower phase 0 and a more intense phase 3. At the end of the day, this means that there is a shorter refractory period here, and hypokalemia would be the exact opposite. So we'll talk more about this in the arrhythmia, ECGs, and the antiarrhythmic drug section.